Okay, the next topic I want to get into is borrower qualification for income-producing properties. So this is a borrower qualification topic very similar to the residential qualification, but here we're dealing with income-producing properties. So we look at commercial lenders, and what do commercial lenders care about? Well, commercial lenders care about the same kinds of things that a residential lender would care about. They care about default risk in terms of income, and they also care about capital risk in terms of the value of the property. But when we talk about income, it's not the individual owner's income that the lender is concerned with, it's the building's ability to generate income. So commercial lenders are loaning for income-producing properties, so it's how much income the property can generate and support the mortgage payment that is of concern. So it has to do with the income of the property, not the income of the property owner. And that's the primary difference. For income-producing properties, we'll look at the loan-to-value ratio to deal with or resolve capital risk. Exactly the same way we did for residential properties, no difference. The debt coverage ratio will be used to deal with the default risk. So let's look at the debt coverage ratio in some detail and see how that works. So for income-producing properties, the debt coverage ratio, it's a ratio, so it's something relative to something else. It's a ratio of net operating income, so that's the income that comes in, relative to the annual mortgage payments, the payments that go out. So net operating income is income that's net of operating expenses. So you start with gross potential rent, subtract vacancy and bad debt, get gross realized income, subtract all your operating expenses, then you get net operating income. So it's net of all the expenses, so it's income that's available to do something with. Most importantly, in this situation, make your mortgage payments with. So that's why we deal with net operating income. And that's divided by your annual mortgage payment. Now, if you think about what these amounts would be, so what would a debt coverage ratio be in terms of a number? Well, if we just assumed for a moment, let's say net operating income from the building is $80,000. Let's also assume the annual mortgage payments are $80,000. So if we have $80,000 divided by $80,000 in this equation, that's 1, right? So would a debt coverage ratio ever be set at 1? Well, if it was set at 1, if the net operating income dropped by even $1, there wouldn't be enough net operating income to make your full mortgage payment. So a debt coverage ratio would never be set at 1. It's going to be set at 1.2 or 1.3 or something higher, which really means there's 20 or 30% more net income available to make your mortgage payment than you need. So there's a cushion, or a safety margin, sometimes referred to as. So that's what debt coverage ratio is most likely to be. So we'll use this equation to help us determine how much can be loaned. So if we abbreviate this equation like this, debt coverage ratio, DCR, equals NOI divided by the payments. These are the maximum payments. Just like we talked about earlier, where the present value of the maximum payments or the maximum loan, the same applies here. Since the present value of the maximum payments is the maximum loan, we need to solve this equation for payments. So we need to put payments on one side of the equal sign and everything else on the other. So we use a little bit of algebra, and we manipulate the equation. This is the form that we get. So this is the form that's most commonly used in the questions that we get. The payments, which are the maximum payment, is equal to the net operating income divided by debt coverage ratio. So that's what we'll use most often. So that's one of the equations or formulas that you do need to know. So let's look at an example, and we'll look at loan-to-value ratio, we'll also look at debt coverage ratio, and we'll see how this works. This is another exam study guide question. Okay. So we'll read through the question, summarize it, and then we'll work through it. Okay. This question says, a borrower approaches the Ripley Finance Company about a mortgage on an income-producing property. The property produces an annual net operating income of $112,500. The lending value of the property is $880,000. Ripley will only lend to a maximum of 80% loan-to-value ratio and requires a minimum debt coverage ratio of 1.25. Ripley's terms are J12 equals 12%, a term and amortization period of 15 years, and monthly payments. The question is, what is the maximum allowable loan rounded to the nearest dollar? Okay. So lots of information here, so let's summarize it on the next slide. Now, there's a long fact pattern to this question, so when I pull out the facts and summarize it, I want to pull out the facts and summarize it in a way that's most helpful to me in solving the question. And by that I mean, I want to summarize information together that I actually use together. So I know that the NOI and debt coverage ratio get used together to give me my payments, so I'm going to summarize them together. So if I'm pulling the information out, I'm writing in my pages, my notes, or circling them on an exam study guide question, I'll put NOI and debt coverage ratio together because I know I have to use them together. So I'm just locating them logically. So NOI is $112,500, debt coverage ratio is 1.25. Next thing I summarize is the lending value and the loan-to-value ratio. I know I have to use those two together, so I'll summarize them together, put them next to each other so they're approximate. This makes it a little bit easier. Saves you from having to go back to the question and reading through all those words all the time, which can take a little bit of time. So this is about being efficient. Lending value is $880,000, loan-to-value ratio is 80%. Next piece of information, or pieces of information, are the interest rate, amortization period, monthly payments. Well, I know I use those together, so again, I'll summarize them together. J12 equals 12% is the interest rate. It's amortized over 15 years, and there are monthly payments. The question is, what is the maximum allowable loan rounded to the nearest dollar? Okay. So I'll summarize this one more time on the next slide as we work through it. So here's my summary. We're looking for the maximum loan. So like we did earlier in the residential borrower qualification, we'll look at the loan-to-value ratio constraint, and we'll also look at the other constraint to do with income. That's the debt coverage ratio. So let's start with loan-to-value ratio. So loan-to-value ratio constraint means that we apply the lending value of the property, in this case $880,000, to the loan-to-value ratio, which is 80% or 0.8. So 0.8 of $880,000 is $704,000. So loan-to-value ratio tells us $704,000 is the maximum loan based on the building's value. We also have to look at the other constraint, of course, and that's the debt coverage ratio constraint. And we use that to find the maximum allowable payments. That's what gives us the maximum payments. So the payments were equal to the net operating income divided by the debt coverage ratio. Right. So $112,500 is the NOI divided by 1.25, which is the debt coverage ratio. That gives us maximum allowable payments about $90,000 a year. So again, those are the maximum payments. We're going to take the present value of these maximum payments to find the maximum loan, so we have to find the payments that match the payment frequency in the question. Well, the question is monthly payments, so again, we'll turn these payments into monthly payments as we've done in previous examples, and we get a maximum monthly payment about $7,500. Now we can finish the question off because we know present value of the maximum payments equals the maximum loan. So just another present value calculation. Let's go through that. The interest rate given in the question is 12%. So 12% is interest rate per year. 12% or 12 is also the periods per year. The loan is for 15 years, monthly payments, so 15 times 12, it's 180 yen. Payments we've already determined were $7,500 per month, and they match our interest rate, and they match our payment frequency, so we're good. $7,500 is our payment. 0 is our future value. The last thing we do is hit present value. Okay. So we get a present value, $624,912. So now what we do, we've got two maximums. We've got a maximum based on the loan-to-value ratio and a maximum based on the debt coverage ratio. So we compare and choose the lower of the two. So $704,000 versus $624,000. Of course, $624,000 is the lower. So therefore, the maximum loan allowable is $624,912. And I believe this question said round to the nearest dollar, so we'll leave it at dollars. So these questions, like the residential borrower qualification questions, work very much the same way. The loan-to-value ratio application is identical. Finding the present value of the maximum payments is also identical. The only difference is the debt coverage ratio. So it's a different equation, it's a different formula, so we do have to know that. We have to know how to apply it to get our maximum payment. And we'll also pay attention to making sure our maximum payment is per month, which matches how our payments are made in the loan. Okay, let's look at one more exam study guide question, also a commercial borrower qualification question, exam study guide number 903. So we'll read through the question, and when we read through it, then I'll give you the opportunity to work through it. So you can summarize it, you can work through it, and I'll check in with you to see if you've got the answer that we'll get when we work through it. All right, so let's read through this question. This question says, the Mombasa Logging Company wants to borrow money to build a head office building in Victoria. The company plans to occupy one floor of the building and rent out the rest. They project that the building's net operating income for the next 5 years will be $637,500 per year. Current mortgage terms on office building projects are J1 equals 14%, amortized over 30 years with quarterly payments. Riverbank feels that Mombasa is optimistic in their net operating income projections and has therefore set the required debt ratio at 1.5. What amount, rounded to the nearest $1,000, could Mombasa borrow from Riverbank? So I'll let you try this one. So summarize this question the way that we did in the earlier example. Summarize it, work through the constraint, and determine what the maximum loan is. And when you've got some answers, when you get a few answers, we'll work through it and see if we all match up at the end. Okay, does anyone have an answer they'd care to share? What did you get?
I got 3.128 million.
3.128 million? 128? 128? 3.128? 129? So we may get a different answer completely that they're now willing to share after we've got all these. 5? Okay. So 3.128 seems to be in the ballpark. Okay. Well, let's solve this question and we'll work through it. So we'll first do the summary. So in the summary, we've got a net operating income, $637,500, a debt coverage ratio of 1.5. The mortgage information is a loan of J1, 14%, amortized over 30 years with quarterly payments. The question was, what amount, rounded to the nearest $1,000, could Mombasa borrow from Riverbank? Okay. So let's work through this. So we'll start with the debt coverage ratio. Was there any information in this question about loan-to-value ratio? No, there's no information at all about loan-to-value ratio, so there's no information. Of course, we can simply ignore it. So sometimes you get questions that are a little bit easier. We didn't have to deal with loan-to-value ratio, so we saved ourselves a small calculation. So we'll just deal with the debt coverage ratio. So the debt coverage ratio, again, is equal to the payments, the maximum payments, are equal to the net operating income divided by the debt coverage ratio. So 637,500, which is our NOI, divided by 1.5, which is our debt coverage ratio, gives us an annual payment of about $425,000, exactly $425,000. Now you recall in the question, the lender here was, not so convinced about some of the prospects for the borrower, so they set the debt coverage ratio high at 1.5. And of course, the effect that has is there's quite a difference between the maximum annual payment, $425,000, and the net operating income. There's over $200,000 in difference there. In other words, that net operating income could fall by more than $200,000, and they'd still be able to make their mortgage payments. So this is a relatively conservative loan. Now, net operating income can, of course, fall. You could have more vacancy or bad debts one period, or operating expenses could be higher for some reason. So it can certainly fluctuate. This would be quite a substantial fluctuation. So we have our annual maximum mortgage payments. The payments in the question are made quarterly. So we'll have to divide by 4. So $106,250 per quarter. We know that the present value of the maximum payments equal the maximum loan. So we'll do one more present value calculation to determine the maximum loan. The interest rate is 14%. That's a nominal interest rate. It's quoted as a J1. Now we know payments are quarterly, which means we need a J4. So we'll start with our 14% interest rate as a J1, and we'll go through interest rate conversion to convert to a J4. So we'll do that first. 14 is the interest rate. Enter that using the nominal interest rate key. Enter 1 period per year, and calculate the effective rate. Enter 4 as our new periods per year. That's our desired compounding frequency to match our quarterly payments. And we'll hit Shift Nominal and calculate a new nominal interest rate. So 13.319794%. So that would be a J4. So if you're working through the question and you didn't get the answer right for some reason, first of all, make sure you've got the right interest rate conversion. Okay. If you've got that right, let's enter the rest of the information. Well, what's the rest of the information? Well, it's the payment, of course. $106,250 is our quarterly payments, entered as a negative as always. It's a 30-year loan, multiplied by quarterly payments, so 30 times 4 is 120 N this time. 0 future value. And we calculate the present value. The present value key, we get $3,128,115. And this question asked us to round to the nearest $1,000, I think it was. So if we round to the nearest $1,000, and that's not round up, that's just round to the nearest $1,000. So it looks like 3.128 million is the maximum loan. So we got 3.128 million. Well done. You get 1 mark, 99 more to go.
For the question that mentioning 5 years, there's any way that we might consider that this 5 years is a term or so, or it's just we ignore that 5 years in the question?
Yeah, we're not dealing with terms when we deal with borrower qualification. We're not dealing with terms, we're only dealing with the ability to pay. So the ability to pay means how many payments can we afford, over what time range can we afford them. So we're going to look at the full amortization period, and that's always going to be the time frame over which we're going to discount our payments, not the term. The term is really unrelated to our ability to pay. The term is all about interest rate risk, not about qualifying. So we don't use it here.
The term might change the payments?
Would the term change the payments? Not usually. The payments are always based on the amortization period. The term is simply the contractual period of the loan. It doesn't affect the payments. It defines what the outstanding balance is, but not the payments. Okay. Any other questions about this example? Let's look at a couple of other exam study guide questions that ask questions that are sort of non-numeric, so no calculation involved, but they're similar to these topics. So exam study guide question 368. Let's look at this question. This question says, in commercial mortgage underwriting, commercial mortgage lending, the factor calculated by dividing the annual net operating income by the annual sum of the monthly mortgage payments is referred to as the safety margin factor. What's the safety margin factor? We haven't talked about that yet. We refer to the borrower qualification for commercial properties as giving a safety margin. So there's something called a safety margin, but it's not what we're referring to here. What about number 2, the mortgage ratio? Do we know what a mortgage ratio is? I don't, so I don't think it's that. I don't think it's mortgage ratio. I could make something up, but I don't know. About 3, debt coverage ratio. Yeah, debt coverage ratio sounds pretty good. Right, debt coverage ratio was a relationship between NOI and payments. What about the annual mortgage constant? No. Annual mortgage constant is a thing. It is a real term, but it's not here. So we like 3, debt coverage ratio. Absolutely. So you might get a question like this that asks sort of about these kinds of topics, not necessarily a question where we have to do some calculations. Let's look at one more. It's exam study guide question 596. This question says, the risk to a mortgagee can be reduced by, we'll look at a number of different factors. Well, first of all, who's the mortgagee? Lender. And the mortgagor is the borrower. So we're talking about the lender here, right? Okay. So the risk to the lender, and if I got this question, I might actually write lender there, just so I'm certain I know who we're talking about. The risk to a mortgagee can be reduced by increasing the amortization period. Now, if we increase the amortization period, that means we're lengthening the time period that we're trusting this person's going to make these payments. Increasing the amortization period, we could borrow more. That wouldn't reduce risk. What about 2? Reducing the monthly payments. If we reduce the payments, would that reduce the risk? Well, if the payments are smaller, is that associated with risk? Well, not really, maybe a little bit. Lower payments might make it easier for someone to make those payments. Does that lower the risk? Maybe a little bit. Not sure that's the best answer. Let's keep going. About 3, reducing the loan-to-value ratio. Yeah, if we reduce the loan-to-value ratio, would that reduce the risk to the lender? Sure, loan-to-value ratio is about risk, right? That was what we used to deal with capital value risk. So 3 sounds pretty reasonable. How about 4? Reducing the debt coverage ratio. So if we reduce the debt coverage ratio, that's going to have the opposite effect. So that's not going to reduce risk. So in this case, I think I like 3. So loan-to-value ratio is about risk. And if we lowered the loan-to-value ratio, say from 80% to 50%, is there less risk to the lender? Absolutely. Because now the value of the property could fall by half, could fall by 50% before they might lose any security in their loan. Okay. So these kinds of questions, I think, are good examples of the kinds of questions you might get that are on these same topics, but there's nothing to calculate. So in addition to kind of understanding how the calculations work, and we've done lots of examples and worked through lots of steps, also understand how some of these work conceptually. So what the idea is behind loan-to-value ratio and risk, and how debt coverage ratio works, and those kinds of things.